Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Italy's drift to the right with Giorgia Meloni set to be the country's first female prime minister and also leader of its most right-wing government since the days of Mussolini. Meloni's Brothers of Italy, which started as a neo-fascist party, scored 26% of the vote and is likely to be a senior party in a new coalition. We're going to hear in a moment from David Broder. David is the author of Mussolini's Grandchidren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. Before then, though, just a reminder that the Byline Times podcast is funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times. That's our wonderful monthly newspaper edited by Hardeep Matharu, which has exclusive content in the print edition that you cannot read online. The great thing about the Byline Times is there's no shadowy oligarch or millionaire backer telling us what to say. We can report without fear or favour because our funding comes from ordinary subscribers, people like you. So please subscribe, if you can, to the Byline Times. You get more details over at our website, bylinetimes.com. That's at bylinetimes.com. And if you have already subscribed, thank you. Let's hear then from David Broder. David, welcome along to the Byline Times podcast. So firstly, before we discuss the importance, the significance of this election result, tell us a little bit about Giorgia Meloni.
Well, Giorgia Meloni has been a political activist since a very young age. She's from Rome, from Garbatella, which is a working class district. Her parents aren't from Rome. But she joined the Italian social movement in 1992. The Italian social movement, MSI, was a neo-fascist party founded by members of the defeated fascist regime in 1946. And it has a long and often violent history in post-war decades and was always quite a small party, the kind of party that would get 5 or 6% of the vote. But Meloni joined it at a time of great upheaval in Italian politics with the death of a lot of the old parties, the end of the Cold War. And she made her career in the MSI. She became a councillor in Rome, then she became an MP, and she became the youngest ever deputy speaker of the Chamber of Deputies when she was only 29 years old. So, in fact, already as a young woman, she became youth minister in the last of Silvio Berlusconi's governments, at a time when the post-fascist party was welcomed into a broad right-wing coalition. So already in the 1990s, former fascists were in government as a junior partner to Berlusconi. But what we've seen over the more recent decades is that the most right-wing parts of that coalition, including former fascists, have become the dominant force. And this election result is really the culmination of that process.
When you mention the MSI then, this party which grew from the ashes of Mussolini's fascism, is that the same as Brothers of Italy? Is that the same party?
Yes and no. In the 1990s, the MSI renamed itself Alleanza Nazionale, National Alliance, and then it directly merged with Berlusconi's party. In those years, its leader, Gianfranco Fini, made some efforts to distance itself from fascism, or let's say to merge some of the fascist influences with a more liberal democratic culture, commitment to taking part in electoral politics, rejection of violence and authoritarianism. That created some conflict in the party at the time. For example, Alessandra Mussolini, the granddaughter of the dictator, quit the party in 2003. After Fini made a visit to Israel, where he strongly criticized the history of the fascist regime. And then Fini eventually took the party into a merger with Berlusconi's party. Fratelli d'Italia was created in 2012 by people who rejected that process and who reasserted the claim to the party tradition. So they adopted the MSI's logo, which is a tricolor flame, and Fratelli d'Italia's flag even now has the flame of the MSI in it. And in the early years of the party, particularly when Meloni sought to assert its ownership over the neo-fascist tradition over other small groups like Casa Pound or Fiamma Tricolore, more extremist and extra-parliamentary groups, she often lent into a very severe denunciation of those who had earlier dissolved the neo-fascist tradition. for instance, calling Fini a mascot of the Masons, of high finance, and so on. So particularly in the early years, the party adopted a very conspiratorial register, but also kind of harked back to neo-fascism. But a lot had also changed, particularly because of the lessening in general of political violence in Italy.
So Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, they wanted to reclaim, in a sense, then, the fascist tradition from which the MSI, the original MSI, had grown.
Yes, that's right. Giorgia Meloni often cites as her political forefather Giorgio Almirante. Almirante was the founding leader of the MSI and led it through most of its history, actually, until his death in 1988. Almirante had taken part in the regime. He had written for a journal called La Difesa della Razza, the defense of the race, in which he advocated explicitly biological racist ideas. Nonetheless, he stands in the Fratelli d'Italia tradition as someone who brought fascists into democracy. Where they had been relatively politically marginalized after 1945, they see him as someone who kept the flame alive. Of course, over the decades, the way that they organized changed and isn't just the same as historical fascism. For instance, a commitment to constitutional process, taking part in elections, generally over time rejected other terrorist groups who were within the orbit of the party, although that was a very conflict-ridden process. And so today what we see in Fratelli d'Italia is a party which celebrates the unbroken tradition of the post-war MSI much more than it actually celebrates the Mussolini regime itself. That brings up a lot of contradictions, of course, because the very people they're celebrating did call themselves fascists, and many of them were veterans of the regime. In fact, even at the time Meloni joined in 1992, still many of the main leaders were people who had directly participated in the Nazi collaborationist Solo Republic.
So there is a genuine historical link then to Mussolini with the party of the woman who is now going to be, in all probability, the leader of Italy.
Yes, absolutely. And often we hear this kind of story, which is that, oh, well, the party's broken with the past, that no longer applies and so on. But when you look specifically at what they're saying, it's actually very indulgent and partial criticism of fascism. For instance, Giorgia Meloni, about a month ago, issued a video for international media where she sought to dismiss claims that her party is indeed steeped in fascism. But what was really interesting was the very kind of pedantic phrasing she used in order to not condemn fascism in general. So a typical way of doing this, and which she repeated, is to condemn its 1938 racial laws, which involved the segregation of Jews and indeed other ethnic minorities from taking part in public life, from children going to school, Jews having jobs in the civil service and so on. So the sort of rhetorical trick, if you will, is to say that that was wrong and that fascism's participation in the Holocaust is to be condemned, but not to condemn the fascist experience in general. And part of what this aims to do is actually to separate a general judgment on fascism from the idea that basically Mussolini went astray when he was led along by Hitler. So even though, of course, there's much to be said about the record of racism and ethnic violence of fascism right from its origins, this is a kind of way of saying, well, fascism wasn't so bad, lots of people joined in good faith, and indeed that the people who continued the neo-fascist tradition after the war are not to be condemned, but rather celebrated because they maintained the tradition of the right and they fought against communists who were even worse. So this party has a much more distinctly fascist tradition than other far-right parties, for instance, the Front National in France.
And you mentioned the Front National, of course. Marine Le Pen attempted to modify what many people regarded as a far-right stance in the recent presidential elections. It wasn't successful for her. She was defeated by Emmanuel Macron. But has Meloni adopted a similar stance? Has she tried to mainstream her appeal in some way?
I think yes, in part, but it's also a very contradictory process. In fact, I'd say that we can generally observe a distinction between Meloni's insistence that she won't disturb Italy's international position. For instance, making a very strong emphasis on the fact that she supports Ukraine, not Russia, that she's committed to NATO, that she wants to sort of change the European Union rather than consider Euro exit. And, even only a few years ago, she had basically the opposite positions on these questions. But much more than Le Pen, she's kind of insisted on Italy's commitment to its Western partners and has a much stronger position against Putin and, for instance, against China, even than parties like the Lega in Italy or Le Pen's in France.
Yeah, because in France, Le Pen didn't actually advocate French exit from the European Union, but there were many people who believed that she would have steered France down that path, made it very difficult for France to stay within the European Union, essentially by breaking its rules, the rules that she disagreed with. There isn't that same sense then from Meloni. She is committed, as far as we can tell, to the EU.
I think, yes, in the sense that that's the way she's framing her agenda now. Of course, it's also true that, firstly, there's some difference between the two cases. Italy is much more vulnerable to tipping out of the European Union accidentally, has much higher public debt. Also, it's the discourse on the possibility of Italexit has been strongly undermined by the recent pandemic. Firstly, the mere fact of the pandemic showing the way in which we're sort of internationally connected, but also the post-pandemic recovery funds. So Meloni actually insisted that she will continue the disbursement of those funds as under the Mario Draghi government, but with some changes, probably actually undermining in particular the focus on the green transition. But I think that there's other ways in which, while this kind of paints the idea of mainstreaming and moderation, there's lots of ways in which that isn't true. And in fact, if you look at her intervention at the CPAC conference with the US conservatives, she actually very explicitly says, I don't want to be part of your mainstream. We're not the right that is on a leash. We know who we really are. So even alongside this kind of basically recognition of something she can't actually change, which is that Italy is basically a quite secondary player in Euro-Atlantic institutions. At the same time, we have this very intense hostility directed against supposed kind of conspiracies of globalists, George Soros, the left, who are basically accused of a plot to destroy Italian society. So Meloni has very often resorted to the language of the so-called Great Replacement theory, or as she sometimes puts it, the plan for ethnic substitution, which basically presents the idea of a kind of shadowy plot to replace white Europeans with immigrants and Muslims. Recently, a very evocative example of this was when she gave a rally with the Spanish far-right party Vox, which, by the way, is also a party which doesn't really want to leave the European Union, but also has these kind of conspiracy theories. So, speaking to that, she said, yes to our civilization, no to the people who want to destroy it. So she has this very combative and hostile approach to domestic enemies and also minority groups, for example, damning the totalitarian power of LGBT lobbies and this kind of thing.
So if you are a migrant in Italy, or a migrant from a minority background anyway, you might be feeling pretty uncomfortable. And if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, you might be feeling very uncomfortable. You've got somebody now who is in all probability the next Prime Minister of Italy, who has voiced outright hostility towards your very existence.
One thing is that Meloni has still got policies which are extremely hostile to immigrants and propose very outlandish and harsh means of repression, including the call for a naval blockade in the Mediterranean to stop migrant boats. She's previously actually even raised the idea kind of provocatively of bombing rescue boats. Of course, one might question whether this is actually going to play out in practice in terms of, actually blockading the entire Mediterranean coast of Italy seems very unlikely, but nonetheless, even a partial application of that policy could, and in fact likely will, mean the deaths of hundreds and thousands of people. even beyond the question of people trying to reach Italy by sea, I think that people in Italy who are from ethnic minorities, or indeed, in a different way, LGBT people, I think even beyond the actual policies pursued by the government, just the example that Meloni sets and the fact that the top charges of the state are controlled by people who hold these ideas and views will unleash a very hostile climate in Italian society broadly. Another example we could take is abortion. Meloni says she doesn't want to get rid of the existing right to seek an abortion. Yet already in the regions controlled by her party, we've seen that they actually act to make access harder, including by imposing kind of unrealistic limits. For instance, a 7-week limit on abortion with a compulsory 1-week cooling off period, which would obviously make it very hard for a lot of people to access that. In a way, it's of course true that, well, we're not going to see the imposition of a fascist regime. But then that's, of course, also a very low bar. I think what we can expect is a more general kind of norm erosion and the pursuit of sort of harsh identity politics and culture wars from the heights of government. And that will also have a very negative effect on a lot of people's lives.
And for people of minority backgrounds in Italy, can we expect any restrictions on their right to live in the country or their right to stay in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key focuses of far-right agitation, and including by Meloni, is that they're opposed to the idea that the children of migrants should have the right to citizenship, even if they're born in Italy. So there are indeed many hundreds of thousands of young people who are born in Italy but don't have Italian citizenship. In some cases, in local councils run by the far-right parties, we've seen them do things like denying free school meals to non-EU citizens, even though, of course, the children in question are born in the country and have no choice but to live there, also with things like school buses. So there's that kind of way of actually really harassing even children who are from ethnic minority backgrounds. And another thing that Meloni has proposed is that non-EU citizens who set up businesses in Italy should have to pay massive sureties, like basically pay an advance payment to prove that they aren't going to do tax evasion. The sort of rhetoric around this is seemingly based on the premise that it is immigrants who are importing the culture of tax evasion into Italy. Of course, one of the main leaders of her government coalition is a convicted tax fraudster. And in general, it's actually true of Fratelli d'Italia's own elected officials that they have far higher propensity to criminality than is true of politicians in general. So I think, yes, there are very definitely means by which this government will make people's lives harder, as indeed did the previous governments, including these parties. The difference this time is that Fratelli d'Italia is the bigger one.
And we've touched on this already, but LGBT people as well, then? They're people who are going to be likely to be victims of an ongoing culture war?
Yeah, I mean, one of the typical themes of Fratelli d'Italia's sort of narration of the way they talk about the world we live in is the destruction of our roots and identity, included by speculators, by online social networks, by the International Republic of Money, as they call it, to create a sort of formless mass of atomized citizens who have no loyalty or roots. And as against this, they pose, the natural, traditional, of course, heterosexual family. That includes a very harsh idea of LGBT people who are basically portrayed as unnatural and rootless and not really belonging, and indeed being like weapons of lobbies which are trying to deracinate the population. And so these ideas, although not necessarily put in the language of historical fascism, do very much belong to the idea of the minorities, and actually particularly Jews, who drive the destruction of community to create the totally liquid society who are just agents of capital. So yeah, I mean, during the campaign, there was an incident where someone with a sort of LGBT flag sort of got up on the stage during one of Meloni's rallies, and she kind of paternalistically said, like, well, we'll have to disagree. And it was kind of staged as a kind of moment of her being sort of consensual and accepting. But then, I mean, it doesn't take...
But accepting clearly very reluctantly.
Yeah, of course, the agreement to disagree is that she agrees that basically they should agree that she gets to have her opinion, which is that, their existence basically counts less. So, yeah, I mean, like, Italy doesn't have gay marriage. It has civil unions. And I think it's unlikely to change under this government, of course. I think the other thing is that I feel that this moment will have a very negative and broad social effect. Of course, it's actually true that a majority of Italians, judging by polls, a majority of Italians do support same-sex marriage and adoption. But basically, I think for the victory for this party will be a boost to all manner of homophobes and reactionaries, including in their sort of everyday interactions.
There have been a few phrases of theirs that you have quoted, David, and as someone of Jewish heritage, perhaps I'm oversensitive to these phrases, but when you've talked about international capital, you've talked about people being in hock to the Masons and so on. Is there an underlying dog whistle anti-Semitism about all this?
Yes. The answer is yes. And we see this in the prominence of George Soros in the party's propaganda. Of course, we can establish a certain connection with the fact that the party has such good relations with Viktor Orban in Hungary, who prominently demonizes Soros in his propaganda. I mean, I'll give a couple of examples, one of which is the claim that George Soros is the figure behind ethnic substitution. And Meloni, in one of her sort of posts about this, referred to him as a usurer. I mean, that word is obviously particularly strongly connotated. Often instead we have like speculators, this kind of thing. Another telling example was on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War One. Meloni sort of issued a film sort of celebrating Italy's defense and then invasion of neighboring territory at the end of World War One. And one of the common World War One slogans in Italy is "the foreigner shall not pass." And so she posted 100 years ago, like today, the foreigner shall not pass. Back then, it was like the armies of Austro-Hungary. Today, it is the speculator Soros, allied to the left, who is sending, immigrants to invade us, and we will defend ourselves. I have to say, I don't feel that I, in general, have been someone who's necessarily always called every new right-wing phenomenon, the return of fascism. But I think you'd have to be very blind to not see that there is indeed a connection between their roots in fascism and their embrace of these ideas. And even though it's not just the same old Mussolinian ideas, they're also drawing on things like Great Replacement theory, reverse colonialism, and these kind of international sort of far-right memes. Often, it's particularly in Italian media, it's kind of like, oh, there's a guy with a flag from the Solo Republic that fought with Nazi Germany, and he's like, then they often say he's a nostalgist. Battles over the past really do matter, and they're important to political identity. But this isn't just about the past. It's also about the way you interpret the crises we have in front of us now, and whether you do indeed think that the way we deal with them, that has to also include people who are non-nationals and minorities, or whether you say, actually, they're the people who are causing the problem. And so in that sense, I think it actually is a quite worrying moment.
And of course, you've mentioned that she's opposed to Putin, that she supports Ukraine, but in her culture wars, she echoes Putin. In her nationalism, she echoes Putin. More broadly, we've seen a movement towards the centre-right, as they would call it, as the far-right, as I think you correctly call it, not just in Italy, but in other countries as well. Sweden, we've seen the rise of AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen's relative success in France, albeit her failure to win the presidential election. So these are troubling times, I think, for Europe as a whole. Tell me a little bit, though, David, about the partners in her likely coalition. Are they further to the right? Are they less to the right?
I think one of the common optical illusions of Italian politics is that as things move further and further right, people who were previously thought to be extreme and beyond the pale themselves become seen as sort of protectors of moderation and normality, and partly because we've sort of seen them already. So, Silvio Berlusconi is a good case in point, in the sense that he's quite widely portrayed as a kind of more pro-European, more moderate figure. And yet, of course, the whole reason why these parties are in government, including the far-right ones, is because he brought them in to his first government in the 1990s, where they hadn't been there before. So in a way, it's kind of like he thought he could control them, and then they have escaped his leadership. Broadly, I think we can say that Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party, is more likely to enter arrangements with kind of centrist and centre-left forces, and probably the one party that would be most likely to leave the coalition once it begins to fail. And also is a party which doesn't have the same roots in neo-fascism. Although, of course, Berlusconi himself has very often made very indulgent comments about the fascist regime, and indeed racist ones. I think that broadly we can say that the Lega is seen as the most disruptive force.
The party which polled, I think, 9% of the votes. This is likely to be the other main party in the coalition.
Yes, that's right. So that's the party led by Matteo Salvini. Historically, it was a northern regionalist party in the wealthier northern regions of Italy, but now he's made it an all-Italian nationalist party. And maybe 2 or 3 years ago, including when he was interior minister, it looked like he was the big winner in the right-wing bloc. He was polling over 30%, and now he's been reduced a lot. So I think the problem they have there is that Salvini will need to differentiate himself, and we can already see some of the ways in which he might do that, one of which is that broadly the Lega is much less supportive of the sanctions on Russia. That said, I think we should also look within Fratelli d'Italia for its contradictions. After all, this is a party which only had 4% of the vote in the last general election, which now has more than a quarter of MPs, and whose voters are actually much more hostile to the sanctions against Russia than any other parties. So I think that although thus far, and before it reaches government, it's kind of a bit easy for Meloni, who's the only opposition leader at the end of the previous parliament, it's kind of easy for her to cast a very broad appeal and to sort of rein in some of her own members. I'm not sure how that's really going to play out in practice. In fact, I would very much expect that, given the likely mediocrity of a Meloni government faced with the energy crisis, is much more likely to play up its kind of identitarian and cultural themes in order to try and hold on to its base. So I think within the coalition, there's 3 different parties, but also even within Fratelli d'Italia itself, it's quite a contradictory party.
Been really fascinating to hear from you, David. Thank you. That's an amazing insight into Giorgia Meloni and her party and the current state of Italian politics. David is the author of Mussolini's Grandchidren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. It really has been an eye-opener, and I hope we've marked your card about the worrying state of modern Italian politics. David, thank you. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline Times podcast, funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times. You get details of how to subscribe over at our website, bylinetimes.com. That's at bylinetimes.com, and subscriptions start from as little as £3 a month. So thanks for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.